Hi, everybody. This is Dan Liebenson, and I'm here back again with B'nai Lappi for today's episode of the Oral Talmud. Hi, B'nai.
Hey Dan, how you doing?
I'm good. So we had some scheduling changes here. We were going to have an interview today, but instead we're going to actually do what I think actually would have made more sense to do today had we actually been looking at the calendar when we were frantically trying to program this show and decide what to do when. But today is the holiday or fast day, I guess. I don't know if holiday is the right word, but fast day of the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. And that's a fast day that has a lot to do with the meta story, as you say, the master story that we tend to be talking about on this show. Or I guess all three of it, right? There's a way in which Tisha B'Av has to do with the biblical master story. There's a way that Tisha B'Av has to do with the rabbinic replacement master story, and I think we're exploring, as we always are, the question about what happens to Tisha B'Av and what happens to the master story when we are potentially in a new one or when the old one is crashed. So it's a kind of appropriate story for us to be talking about, and I don't think we're going to be anchoring in a particular Talmudic text today. It's just going to be more of a free-flowing conversation about this, and I think we'll get to some interesting places.
Yeah, when I think about Tisha B'Av, I feel like it should be the yontiv of option 3. It
Huh.
should be. It should be like the holiday of the crash theory and where we're going to go next. But it's somewhere along the line, it feels like it went off the rails.
Hmm.
Like I think a lot of Jewish holidays. And as I was thinking about it, like I'm actually not into most Jewish holidays.
Uh-huh.
It's really hard for me.
Hmm.
And I think this is why. I think they're all really smart, but they got stupid somewhere along the way.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that actually, it makes sense to me that
Huh.
they would have gotten stupid, that along the way they got, like the story of the guru who puts the cat out. You know that story?
I don't think so.
It's the story that circulates in Buddhist circles of why there are certain sort of illogical or unexpected surprising practices, like sacrificing a cat. Oh, we sacrifice a cat every year. This is not a real thing that people do, but it's a story. Why do we sacrifice a cat every year? Well, it turns out that the guru years ago put the cat out to not disturb the meditators, and the cat died in the cold, and ever since then people have been sacrificing a cat every year. So there's a certain amount of that happens, a kind of misunderstanding of what a commemoration or a holiday is really about, and then it becomes something else, and then it gets stupid.
Huh.
um, so I think Tisha B'Av was probably really smart when it started.
So say a little bit more about that, like when it's smart, when it's stupid, but like what do you see as what it's really about? I guess let's start there.
Well, I think it's about, I feel very influenced by your realization that moving forward requires a mourning of what is past. I mean, I think that's really, really, really important. And I think that's what Tisha B'Av is. I remember when Molly was little, and before she would go to bed, she would say good night to every little thing in her room. Good night, picture the bunnies, good night, carrot, good night, lettuce. And it's like the book Good Night Moon. That book is wildly popular because parents know that kids will go to sleep more easily after they've said goodbye, good night to the things around them. They can let go. It's kind of miraculous. And I think Tisha B'Av is like good night moon. It's like good night temple. And now we can go to sleep. Now we can move on. I think you're really right about that. It's a way to say it's okay, goodbye to that. But the problem is when you just say goodbye and then you don't say, okay, now let's roll up our sleeves. Then it becomes stupid. Then it becomes like sad and mourny. And oh, I wish we had that back, rather than let that go. And what can we get now?
Well, it's interesting because I heard from our mutual friend that I said that about Tisha B'Av, and I was trying to remember, did I say that? It's very possible because it's entirely consistent with things that I'm sure that I did say, which
Uh-huh.
is that that I tend to talk about the Messiah as a character in Jewish lore, and the study of Torah for its own sake, as meaning in particular, why do we study things that we no longer do? Why is the Talmud full of so much about the temple practice when it was composed? I mean, the beginning of the composition was long after the temple practice had been over. I mean, it had been over for 150 years or so by the time the Mishnah was put into writing. So it seemed like it wasn't coming back anytime soon. And I mean, 150 years, it's like in historical terms, it's like, 150 years is like one lecture in a history survey. But if you think about 150 years, before now, we're talking about, this time of the Civil War. I mean, we're talking about a long period of time ago, right? And so anything that, hadn't happened since the time of the Civil War, it's unlikely that if you were to write a book about it in today's America, that you were making a serious thought that we were going to go back to that time. I mean, so much has changed. So that's the order of magnitude. But when the Talmud was actually completed as a document, we're talking about an additional 300-400 years. And so, this is the entire history of Europeans having arrived in the Americas, right? I mean, that is a long time ago. Christopher Columbus, that's a long time ago. And so the idea that this book that was written, in the equivalent of 2020, that is talking about things that haven't existed since the time of Ferdinand and Isabella, would in some fashion be a serious attempt to do something about that. That's absurd. So then the question is, why is the Talmud full of this information? And so my thinking about it, and why should we keep studying it, is really the more, and that, another 1,500 years later, why should we keep studying this stuff?
Hang on one sec. When you say full of this information, are you referring to references to the temple and one day we'll have it again?
No, more, not so much that, more just the details of what you used to do. I mean, the Talmud is full of, we've been doing this daily Talmud page, and we're in the tractate of Shabbat. And everything is about, well, if you do this wrong thing, then you're liable to bring a sin offering. Well,
right.
The time this was put into its edited state, nobody had brought a sin offering in more than 500 years. So what is this about? Why are we even talking about it this way? And and the question for me is even less, why did the editor put all this stuff in there? But why should we keep studying that 1,500 years later? And my answer is because that is actually a core technology in Judaism that allows us to keep moving forward, because we sort of make a pledge. The reason, I mean, my hypothesis is that the reason we still study that stuff today is because we sort of made a covenant to do so 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. We kind of, meaning that I'm not sure there actually is a good reason to keep studying that stuff today, but I think that the reason is because our ancestors 1,500 years ago sort of promised to do so, and we're fulfilling their promise. And the question is, why did they promise to do so? And I think they promised to do so because they understood that it was the only way to kind of get the permission from their society to move forward, to say, we promise you, we will never, ever, ever forget this stuff. And we're going to make it the most central thing that we're going to pass on to our children and our children's children, that we have this principle, that we study these ancient things, and that we have this myth, this character of the Messiah who one day is going to bring them back. And we know that's not going to happen. But we promise that we are going to keep that story going, because we know that you folks, you more conservative folks, you need to hear that in order to let go of those things. And if we don't have an idea like that, then the conservative folks will hold us back from being able to do the innovation that we need to do in order to move forward. And that goes back to our conversation about Rabbi Eliezer and the Oven of Achnai story, and how, that conservative voice has so much power that if you don't treat it with respect, it's going to come back and bite you. And so I think that this now, and I don't remember if I said it about the 9th of Av, but it's very much of a piece that to say. And also, I by the way, I know that I have said it about Yom Kippur, right? Why do we do the Avodah service in the Yom Kippur service? Why do we kind of reenact and tell the story about the service in the temple? Again, I think it's part of this idea that part of the way that at least Rabbinic Judaism has been built is that we have these kind of ritualized remembrances of the past. And I think it's misunderstood by most people, and not wrongly so. I mean, I think that's kind of part of the deal, that it should have been misunderstood. But in a time like now, it's a little bit dysfunctional to misunderstand it. And what I'm saying,
that's what I mean about it getting dumb. Oh yeah,
no, exactly. And well, it get dumb, or like there's certain times when you have to go back to the core, memory, the core practice of, like you say, the idea that what's in the Talmud is a handbook for what we should do when their system breaks down. If their system has worked for 1,500 years, the problem is that we forgot that that's what the Talmud is about. Yeah, and it gets dumb in that way. But but whether it's the Avodah service and the Yom Kippur service, or a whole holiday, a whole fast day like the 9th of Av, and there are other fast days that also commemorate elements of the destructions, right? The 17th of Tammuz and whatever. And that we actually have those. I mean, the best way, I guess, to think about it is that they're analogous to a yort site, or the Yizkor service, where we remember our human ancestors who have died, and nobody is confused about those. Nobody thinks that means that we should dwell on that person's life the rest of the year and like hold back from doing what we need to do in our lives because maybe grandma wouldn't have approved. It's exactly the opposite. It's
well, let's bring grandma back. Grandma's not coming back.
Well, right. But by the way, that's why I actually love the Day of the Dead. And maybe we could talk about that. I of all the holidays that I know about from like other religions that I feel like Judaism is missing one, I actually think the Day of the Dead would be a beneficial one to try to sort of figure out how to create a Jewish version of that. Because I think that idea that the dead actually come to visit us, there's something about it. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something about it that I actually feel is valuable. But the idea that we have the annual day where the person died, their yort site, and also some number, is it 4, some number of days a year where we say the Yizkor service traditionally. Most people only do it on Yom Kippur, but there are some others. And that the point there is that I think that what all of this does is it helps us alleviate our guilt that we have moved forward. So it says we're going to spend X number of days, X number of hours a year sort of focusing on the stuff that has died, so that we feel we've done it enough honor so that we can spend the rest of the year doing something completely different and not feeling guilty about it because we've done that honor. It's something like that is
I love that.
Where I'm going with it all.
Big snaps on that. I love that. That sounds absolutely right.
And I think maybe when you say it's gotten stupid, it's like, it feels like the way that people think about Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, this day that commemorates the destruction of both temples, is that somehow we should be mourning in the style of we wish it would come back. Like we actually what we're doing actually is a second rate. And maybe that's actually part of it. Maybe you should do that once a year because it's actually good. But we don't really think that, in the same way that we don't really think the Messiah is coming. But we should take it seriously on that one day. Maybe, I don't know, like maybe I should mourn more on the 9th of Av. I tend to not be that focused on it because I'm not that upset that we don't have a temple. But maybe I'm actually doing it wrong, I think.
But I think what you're getting at is we're still naming the thing that we're actually well enough past that we're no longer really guilty about it. And we need to plug in to the place of temple a whole bunch of other things which we want to alleviate our guilt over leaving behind. And I think that's the question of Tisha B'Av.
Right. Oh, right. So in that sense, Yes. So I think that what I would say is that the problem is that our mourning for the temple is now crowding out our bandwidth to do the mourning for the Judaism that we grew up with, that right, that we also
Which
need to
has
move,
crashed. That's right.
which is crashed, right? And that we need to move into the mourning category. But because the mourning category is too full of this other stuff, right?
Right.
We don't feel like, right, there's something, and that we've forgotten that that's actually part of our technology,
That's right.
that we are not able to mourn the loss of rabbinic Judaism or elements thereof, and as a result, we cling to them because we would feel too guilty to move away from them. And that is actually stifling the innovation, right? That is making the innovation too conservative and too, because everybody wants to try to save the synagogues as opposed to grieve the synagogues, for example.
Right. You know what just passed through my mind? It's like we've so misunderstood Tisha B'Av, whereas it should be a framework. We're looking at the content. It would be as if every year on Yom Kippur, you did tshuva for the same thing you did tshuva for a long time ago, because that's what you do on Yom Kippur. You did tshuva for that thing. No, you do tshuva is the framework, and you do it for whatever you need to do it on this year. And so Yom Kippur actually isn't stupid. It's really still smart because we've remembered that it's a framework and not, right?
It's so interesting because it actually relates to this morning. I was listening to the podcast of Preet Bharara, the former U.S. attorney in New York, and he was fired by Trump, and he has a podcast. And his guest today was Jake Tapper, the CNN reporter. And Preet Bharara opens it by saying, hey, Jake, I actually did some research on you, and I had heard this story before. And it turns out that you were, and he didn't give all the details, but that you got in trouble in your Jewish day school. He didn't say the Jewish day school, but I know it was a Jewish day school. You got in trouble in your Jewish day school because of a certain cartoon that you did in the yearbook, right? And what the story was that Jake Tapper had created this kind of Mad Magazine style fold-in that if you folded it in, it was a piece of the male anatomy.
Oh my God, I've totally forgotten about those. I remember that from when I was a kid. Yeah.
Right. And this was in his Jewish day school, high school yearbook. Right. So it was really, and it caused a scandal and, an uproar. And it was discovered, I think, on the day of graduation, and they held back their diploma and made them do community service and whatever.
Oh my gosh.
And Preet Bharara says to Jake Tapper, this was 30 years ago, right, or more. Preet Bharara says to Jake Tapper, do you feel bad about that or something like that? And Jake Tapper is like, look, I mean, if you're asking me if I would have done that again in my 51-year-old body, if my 51-year-old brain was in that 18-year-old body, I wouldn't have done that. But if you're asking me if I sort of feel terrible now that I did that when I was 18, I mean, I was a different person then. I was rebelling against authority. I was should I maybe not have done it? Maybe, but I don't have to keep repenting for that. That's right. My point, right? Right. 30 years later, Jake Tapper doesn't have to keep repenting for the fact that he made a, X-rated fold-in his high school yearbook at some point, right? And that's what you're saying about the tshuva, about we all know that we should be repenting on Yom Kippur for the sins we did this year, not for the sins that we did 30 years ago. And yet we are still mourning the destruction of 2 Judaisms ago. That's the thing. And that's fine. It's not as silly to mourn the destruction of 2 Judaisms ago as it might be to be repenting over some, minor sin that you committed 30 years ago. But if that is so crowding out your, meaning if you're spending the entire day mourning that sin, that you don't have time to mourn the fact that you just, embezzled money last week, I mean, that's bad.
Yeah, and the more I think about this analogy, which just came to me as we're talking between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, Tisha B'Av is kind of the institutional mourning holiday, right? It's when we mourn communally, and we mourn for our communal, it's been framed that way, communal sins, and we'll put a sticky on the wisdom of saying, oh, it was my fault, it's our fault that these things happen to us. We'll go back to that later. But if this really is a communal Yom Kippur, a kind of institutional, Jewish institutional Yom Kippur, then it makes even more sense that that at a certain point we stop mourning for, or like you say, add the new institutional things. I think we should flesh out. I mean, let's get into retail a little bit.
Yeah.
What should we be putting in this container of
Yeah.
Tisha B'Av that, God willing,
Yeah.
you know, in 2,000 years, people will be talking about on Tisha B'Av that they're mourning?
And just before we do that, just to reinforce what you said about the changing or the adding on, I learned this text from Yehuda Kurtzer. I don't remember where it's from exactly in the Talmud, but it's basically a description about the prayer that the high priest would say on Yom Kippur. And it's very clear from that text that in the Talmud's, at least understanding of the Second Temple period, Yom Kippur was not a holiday of personal atonement. It was a holiday of communal atonement. And so that the personal atonement part was added on. And there was an interesting, one of the prayers is that God should not, like asking God not to listen to the prayers of travelers, because the traveler wants it not to rain, so that, but the community needs rain. So specifically, it's a holiday focusing on the community's needs and not the individual's needs. And our Yom Kippur is very much about the individual's needs and not the community's needs. So these holidays change is really my point. And it's so that idea that Tisha B'Av would be tweaked, wouldn't be any more scandalous than Yom Kippur would be tweaked, and Yom Kippur has been tweaked.
Wow, I love that. And you reminded me of parts of the liturgy, you know, like when the Chazan, I don't know, when I was a kid in our shul, the Chazan would walk down, you know, the center aisle, and it was, you know, the Hineni, and oh my gosh, right? And he's saying, I need to do this on behalf of the whole community. And you're right, we lose that. We have lost that. We've made that shift. And it's been a really effective shift. You're right.
Yeah. And you know, one of my thoughts that I've been thinking about Yom Kippur is like, what would be next for Yom Kippur? That's a different conversation. But for Tisha B'Av, so yeah, let's go to retail. I mean, like, because yeah, I mean, there's two aspects. Right? One is what is the practice, and two is what are we mourning for, right? And so right now, you know, in a way, like that feels a little bit. Those two are like out of sync for me, because the idea of a full-on fast, I find it hard on Tisha B'Av, because I feel like you know, the Holocaust happened not too long ago. If you want me to spend a day in grief and fasting, like, let's have that be about the Holocaust and Holocaust Day. Like, you know, so here for Holocaust Day, we don't do much. I mean, we maybe have like an evening program, you know, and for Tisha B'Av, we're fasting and you know, torturing our souls or whatever, you know, for something, for the you know, like that. So I feel like I could accept the practice if the other, if things that I was really sad about were lumped over there, or I would want a less onerous practice.
Well, I think it's really interesting that you bring up Yom HaShoah, because this day that I don't know so much the history of how it came, but I know there was a debate about shouldn't Yom HaShoah actually be incorporated in Tisha B'Av. This is what Tisha B'Av is about. And I think that the decision to not do that is precisely I would call it a mistake, to misunderstand that Tisha B'Av is actually a container and not the thing the container is containing.
The only piece that as I'm thinking this through now, that I would wonder about in terms of that, which I would have said the same and would have thought the same, that Tisha B'Av, that the Holocaust should have been folded into Tisha B'Av, is that if Tisha B'Av is these commemorations of destructions that we aren't really so sad about anymore, you know, or like that we, meaning that we're sad sort of in a removed kind of way, but we're actually doing it we're actually commemorating them because there's a minority within our community that can't stop thinking about that, and that we need to help them let go. Like the Holocaust is actually a much more, you know, active thing to be sad about. So So I'm not sure. I mean, part of I think that the reason why Holocaust Day was made separate had more to do, I think, with Israel and Zionism and things like that. So I'm not sure exactly what the history was, but I can see it both ways. But I think that yeah, I think that for me, it's kind of, it would be like, I mean, it sounds a little silly almost to say it because there hasn't been a physical destruction, and maybe COVID maybe COVID is really, but to put synagogue services, the in there, it's to say, like, before COVID, there was such a thing as synagogue services, and a building on Shabbat, and people, and after COVID, it kind of fizzled out, and it never came back after COVID, I mean, and then they're saying, oh, but there was a synagogue in Los Angeles that continued to have services, and you're like, yeah, and there was also a temple in Egypt that tried to bring back the temple service, but it didn't really last very long, and of course, right now we don't know if that's the story or not, but I mean but it could be, and I suppose, yeah.
Yeah, and your point about we don't know yet, I think is really important, because maybe you don't fill the container of Tisha B'Av. You don't mourn for the thing until you're past it, and yeah, it's over. We don't treat a dying person as if they're already dead. We're sure that in all ways we treat them as a fully alive human being. And I don't know. So maybe it's not time to, fill out the death certificate for the synagogue. But I think your point that the fact that there are some synagogues that do it great may not actually mean the synagogue isn't dead.
Right.
I mean, it's hard. I shouldn't, I don't know. I'm a little reluctant to talk about it in public this way.
Right. Well, who should we throw under the bus publicly?
But anyway, I think the synagogue is for sure. It's the question is that what is not going to make it into the next option 3?
Mm-hmm. I agree with you, though. Like, I think it's good to do a little bit of retail, a little bit of speculation, but I think that part of it is that we don't know and we can't know, and that we aren't trying to, we don't want anybody to be in that position.
Yeah. Okay. I just thought of something. I'm thinking of my teacher, David Kramer, and maybe we shouldn't be thinking about structures and institutions and practices that no longer work, but the ideas that no longer work and the ideas that we need. Because one of the things I learned from David Kramer is that the rabbinic revolution at its core was really about a single idea. It was the idea that truth is indeterminate. Unlike the past, where you could know, or we felt we could know the truth, and everyone thought they had a line on the truth and could access it. What Kramer says is that the rabbinic revolution was the idea, and he says this is an idea that not only changed Judaism, but changed Western thought completely. For everybody, is the stance that, yeah, there may be a truth, but not one of us can actually get at it. So it's this deep humility, which is the new idea. So it's not like it's this holiday, this practice, but it's a shift in thought. So that makes me, what do you think about that? And it makes me wonder what those shifts in thought should be. And I have some ideas about that.
Right. Well, first of all, it makes me think that we should have him back on the show, because he didn't say that when we were talking. Like, I don't remember that part. So I'd like to hear more from him. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you the one that most, the one that feels most powerful to me, but I don't know that I've been articulating it as well as I can, and it's a little frustrating to me because I want to, and it's a complex notion, but it comes from Yitz Greenberg's theology, which I don't know if I really like. I'm not sure what he really thinks was true theologically, meaning like what God actually was doing in the past, or is he sort of saying that the understanding of God has changed over time? Maybe it doesn't matter, but I think that the way that I understand his theology is that in each of these great eras of Judaism, God has moved further away from a kind of responsibility taking role in the world, so that in the biblical era God actually is an actor. God is physically, God is first of all is immanent and is literally fed by the odor of sacrifices, but God is also there stopping the sun and creating miracles and helping people win wars. And that's the God of the understanding of the biblical era. In the rabbinic era, there's a notion that God's not doing that anymore. God is still there. God is still around enough that it's worth bothering to pray to God, because God is somehow involved. I'm not 100% sure that I have a clear read on the rabbi's understanding of God. Maybe you could explain that a little bit. You do, but somehow it wasn't a waste of time to be praying and blessing this God, that somehow that might inure to your benefit, and God was, but God doesn't do these grand miracles anymore. Prophecy is over, and God's no longer being fed by our sacrifices, and so we don't have to do that anymore. And yet Greenberg's idea is that as God withdraws from the responsibility taking element of the world, that God's responsibility now rests on human shoulders. And as God's responsibility is left on the earth, we need more humans to shoulder that responsibility. And so we get an expansion of the leadership class. So you move from a hereditary priesthood, which is very small, to a rabbinic, to rabbis by ordination, which is larger, but still pretty small. And that's the shift from biblical to rabbinic Judaism. And then the current era in which we're in the shift, we're part of the shift. And Yitz talks, I think his theology was very much informed by the Holocaust, that not that God, that the Holocaust in a way was evidence that God had already withdrawn even further from that kind of responsibility taking in the world, to the point that, as I understand it, functionally God is not around to take responsibility. God is around in a new way. That's the part of Yitz's theology that I don't quite get, but it's very important to him to say that as God withdraws from involvement, God is actually closer to us in a certain way. I don't know that I quite understand that, but at least in terms of the responsibility taking, God has basically completely withdrawn.
Yeah, I remember Yitz. I was so blessed to be able to learn with Yitz when I worked at Klal and later, and I love the way he talked about the relationship with God as a partnership. Mm-hmm. And it used to be that we were junior partners. That's how he talks about it. Uh-huh. We're sort of junior non-voting partners at the board meeting. And for sure in the rabbinic era, but definitely with the Holocaust, we're becoming senior partners. And, God becomes the junior non-voting partner. And so I think it's both a shift in who our sort of level of responsibility in relation to God, and, as you said, a democratizing shift from an elite class to the entire people.
I'm not sure if Yitz has said this, but I suppose it's kind of like as the relationship between a parent and a child, and as the child grows up, the parent has less and less responsibility for the child and power over the child. But nevertheless, if it's a good relationship, you actually hope that there's a sweetness and a closeness which actually increases over that time. So I guess there's a way in which I do understand. I think that's what he's trying to get at. But his real point in this next era, which we're still in the process of transitioning to, and this is where I'm going to, this is where I think is like the big shift, is that all of God's responsibility is no longer with God. All of God's responsibility has shifted to human beings. In Yitz's paradigm, therefore, we need even more human beings to shoulder that responsibility. It's a huge responsibility. So maybe everyone, we need everyone to shoulder that responsibility. But once you are understanding yourself to be shouldering 1/7 billionth of God's responsibility, right, or something like that, then I think there's no more authority. Like nobody has authority. It's not that God doesn't have authority. It's that humans also don't have authority over other humans. The rabbis no longer have authority. Every person, every Jew is equally responsible for a piece of God's responsibility. And so to me, the gift is that in a world like that, the notion of the rabbis that the rabbis had of themselves as in some fashion channeling God's responsibility, God's authority, to me that's gone. That so there's nobody who can claim authority in this next era. And my question is, what does a Judaism look like where there is no authority? That's
Here's what comes up for me as you're saying that. The truth is, the rabbis never really did have any more authority than any other person. They just understood that their learning qualified them or sort of certified them to make rulings on behalf of other people. And it's just probably in the reality of who has enough time to learn enough to make informed decisions that it when that, I don't know, I'm not sure.
But I think what I'm saying is like the people, of course they didn't. I mean, I don't believe that they actually had authority. Like, meaning I don't really believe that God gave them authority or that they had.
Right, but I
But
don't think
people
they did
accepted it.
either. Go ahead, go ahead.
But people accepted that authority, and in a way, what I'm saying,
Yeah,
and a lot of people today will say, yeah, but people still accepting that authority. There's a lot of people that want to know what the rabbi thinks or whatever, and I think that that's true. But most of the people who don't accept the authority are just leaving
right,
because they can. So yes, the people who are staying accept the authority, but that's like saying that the one synagogue, yeah, there was still a synagogue in LA that was
right.
having services after. It's like, yeah, there's still always going to be some. I mean, there's still some people that would. We know that actually there's a lot of people that if they somehow could, they would want to bring sacrifices. Those people, they're going to continue, and God bless them. I don't want, that's fine, but don't confuse the fact that there are still some people who are into that structure, for whom that master story is not crashed. Don't confuse that for that the master story hasn't crashed. Like it
Right.
crashed for most people. And so the question to me for the person who is kind of out of the game because they're like, but I'm a doctor. Why should I tell this guy to I might have told the story like a friend who sort of overheard a doctor, an Orthodox doctor, I think, saying, he was asking to rabbi what should he do with a cake that he'd been given by a neighbor, and whether and her takeaway from this was, I can't believe that this guy is a brilliant doctor and he has to ask a rabbi what to do with a cake. Like it's crazy. Like just decide for yourself what you want to do with the cake, and it just doesn't stand to reason to me that there's going to be a lot of doctors and lawyers and business people and billionaires and all these people and all just regular people that will say, yeah, I really want to live in a world where I have to ask somebody else what to do with a cake. It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
no, I want to live in a world that respects me as a thinking person, as an educated person. And I don't, is it really so complicated?
Yeah. I remember, you're reminding me of, and maybe this is the shift. I think this is what you're suggesting, that the thought shift of today is from a small group of people that we've been calling rabbis have the authority to tell the rest of us what to do. And that's going to be different. And what is that going to look like? Anyway, I'm remembering, gosh, it was probably 1992 or so. It was the Rabbinical Assembly Convention. And there are thousands of rabbis there. And I was a rabbinic student at the time. And Harold Schulweis, Alav Shalom, was giving this sort of big plenary speech. And I remember him saying, and I remember it because you could feel sort of the shock and pain in the room when he said, Jews will no longer be told when to marry and whom to marry. They will no longer be told what to eat and when to eat, and so on. And it was like, oh my God, somebody said it.
Hmm.
And it like, are we really there? Oh, I don't know. There was just so much emotion in the room. And now, it doesn't seem as shocking or right. But we're still in that period of rabbis, you know, having a hard time letting go of that fact. And you're right, the folks, so many Jews have left because long ago they wouldn't be told. And if the assumption is the community is a place where you're told, you know, I'm going to go option 2 on that. That's not what I want.
Yeah. Well, you said you had other thoughts on like what was the big
Yeah.
thing?
So I think we know that feminist insights and queer insights have got to be part of the Jewish future. The
Mm-hmm.
Jewish future, I think, has got to be feminist. It's got to be non-heteronormative, right? It has
Yep.
to have a very different take on what it means to be a human being.
Yep.
So I think that's part of our current shift.
Yeah. I think not, there's a part of me, I mean, I want to say this with understanding that there's a part, it may just be my wishful thinking to like draw these things together. In my mind, these two things are of a piece. They're saying they're fundamentally, and I'm not sure like which is primary and which is driving which, but because I think there's a way of saying that in a non-patriarchal world, part of what it means to be non-patriarchal is to not accept that way of thinking about how the organization of the world works, which is that there's like somebody in charge because of their power. In the traditional case, their power because of race or gender, or but I think it's interesting to think about rabbinic authority in relation to other forms of patriarchy, because it's, and I don't mean that as an insult. I mean that as a question about whether all systems that are fundamentally authority based are basically outflows of a patriarchal system, which, I've said this before in different contexts. Like, I'm always asking this question about like, what would Judaism or any system that we have today look like through a universal design approach, which would say, what would it look like if we're designed ab initio, as the translation of the Talmud in the Stein does the lechatchila, but if it was designed initially by and for those folks who were understood by the previous system to have, quote, a disability, is not even actually a disability. It's only a disability in reference to the old system, which wasn't designed by them, and therefore made them have a disability, including being queer or being a woman, which is like fundamentally, you have to see it as being treated by the patriarchal world as a form of disability. So put of all those folks in one category, you actually have a majority of humanity, right? Because you have all women, and then you have, queer men, and then you have, all kinds of other people who don't fit in, and you have a majority of humanity, and you say, well, actually, what would the world look like if that majority of humanity was the one that created it? And
it told the story about it.
And it's also about it, and especially if it's in reaction to thousands of years of history that had come before of a patriarchal authority-based approach, and then that one of the pieces of that universally designed new approach is going to be like a smashing of the patriarchy, and it's going to be saying like, we want whatever that was, we want the opposite, and so that becomes, and yet we want to feel connected to it. Right, like that becomes the interesting part about the Tisha B'Av and all that. Is there a way that we can smash the patriarchy and still say, but we have fond memories? Or, I don't know, like how are you thinking about that?
I'm reading Ibram Kendi right now, and my mind is just being absolutely blown.
Which book are you reading?
I just finished Stamped.
Uh-huh.
Which is actually the young adult version of Stamped from the Beginning.
Oh.
And so I have to go back and now read Stamped from the Beginning. But for my anti-racism study group, I needed to get it read before the
conversation. You basically read the Cliff Notes.
I read it, yeah. And now I'm reading How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Uh-huh.
And the shift in what the story is, depending on who's telling the story, is just unbelievable. And that we allowed ourselves to accept this story of racism, or not even to have it be a non-story because white people were telling it or failing to tell it, and not listening to the folks upon whose bodies it was being told. It's just unbelievable. I mean, it's right.
I mean, the way that I think about that story is that for me, as a white man, but also as somebody who was kind of late to the story, right? Because my family immigrated to America, in the last century. Um, it the master story of America is crashing and has crashed for me. But what's interesting, interesting, it's like troubling, it's I don't know what the worst possible word is. It's horrifying that it never really crashed for Black Americans. It was crashed from the beginning, like meaning it was. So what do you call that? And
Yeah.
so when
I know.
you talk about how it crashes for the queer folk first.
Yeah.
But what about the queerest of the folk for whom it crashed before it even started? Like
Right.
that's
I know. Next week I'm going to be doing a crash talk on what I'm learning about racism, anti-racism, white supremacy, and I'm having such a difficult time plotting it out over the scheme because I'm not sure what the master story is
right,
and for
right,
whom it's crashing. My brain is exploding
right.
because there's right. Oh my God.
I mean, I think the only way to tell the story of America through the crash talk is to say we're talking about white America's story, and but
And how that's crashing
and how that's
for
crashing
white. Yeah.
for white Americans, right?
Yeah.
But then it's like, but then then what that raises for me though is that when you tell the crash story about Judaism, it's like whose story are we not telling in the Jewish
Right.
story for whom it
Exactly.
never worked ever?
Ex-
Who yeah.
that's right.
And so both are important. I mean, both are worth telling. But but I think obviously all of these stories are no story that can be told well is going to be accurate. You have to simplify it and make it
Right.
powerful, which your crash talk is, and yet then you kind of hit the reality, and it's like, okay, how do I think about this?
Yeah. It's trying to figure out this theory over our reality and our lives has really helped me understand. Like the option 3 on the racism and white supremacy story is what Black folk knew way before the master story. This quote unquote master, I mean, just the name master story. Let's put a sticky on that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
It's what
Oh,
you're saying. Um, and now I'm realizing that some of the stuff that goes into the option 3 story isn't just stuff that the folks from the crumble knew.
mhm,
It's the stuff that the folks before this master story
mhm,
came about because it was oppressive from the get-go.
uh-huh,
Like you're
uh-huh,
saying, because a certain class for whom it was going to work was
uh-huh.
creating it. Right? It's going, oh my God.
Well, it's funny. It reminds me. It's making me think of that. I don't know if you saw it. There was this part of the Chris Wallace interview with Donald Trump where he says, like, 1776, like that's the beginning of America. That's the important time. And I don't know. They're trying to do this 1619 thing. I don't even know what that's about. Or, and Chris Wallace says slavery, and he's like, that's what they say. But and 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 it's like, but fundamentally, that's the question is like, where does the American story begin and for whom?
Right.
And it's not only a question of, for whom and who would never question. It's like, if you tell the story from the perspective of African Americans, it's like, it actually starts long before, and where you decide to start the story is part of what the story is. It's also fraught. Look, I mean, there's a way actually to try to bring this back around to Tisha B'Av and the Jewish part of the story. Um, you know, at least at least I don't know exactly. I haven't, because we didn't know we were necessarily going to be talking about this, so I didn't do all the research. But do you know if Tisha B'Av, if there's any evidence that Tisha B'Av existed before the time of the rabbis?
Yes. Yes. In um in the story of, well, that's the rabbis in Ta'anit in the Talmud talking about the story of the spies. and retrojecting
Right. No,
Tisha B'Av back, right? You know that.
yeah, no, but what I'm suggesting, or what I want to suggest, what I'm floating, but I want to know if there's any evidence, against me here, is that the rabbis invent Tisha B'Av as a holiday, a day of mourning for, basically for their most recent tragedy, which is the destruction of the Second Temple. But then they say, but actually, it's not only for the Second Temple; it's also for the First Temple, and
and they say it's also for the lack of courage and creativity way back in the biblical era when the spies came back and said, we're like grasshoppers and they're giants, and oh no, we can't do that. And I think that's how that's what we've lost of Tisha B'Av.
Oh, that's interesting.
Tisha B'Av, it has to be paired with let go of that and have not only hope, but courage and a sense of experimentation and adventure and even radical innovation. They have to go together. And I think the rabbis pointing back to the failure of the spies is the rabbi saying that's the part of Tisha B'Av that you can't let go of. It's not only about what's lost, it's about having that courage to look at the giants and say, yeah, we can, or those who looked like giants. And I don't know, there's something there.
Yeah, but I think that what I'm trying to figure out is like, I don't know how we kind of retroject something into previous versions of the story. Like in the rabbi's imagined world, the Tisha B'Av was observed, ever since the destruction of the first temple as remembering the day, and even before that during the time of the first temple, it was observed to remember the spies' failure. And this holiday that they invented, they actually kind of retroject, or they create a past history for it, that kind of pulls that pulls together. And I guess that I'm suggesting that what would it look like? What would it look like to do that today? I think, I'm not sure if I'm talking about Tisha B'Av specifically, or I'm talking about some way in which we re-understand our past in a way that actually the Jews have never understood it before. So let's, and then it may or may not be true. It may or may, but it may be that we discover something in our past. Like actually, there's a book that came out in Hebrew within the last year, which I haven't really read, but it's called the Jewish March of Folly. The March of Folly was an important book by Barbara Tuchman about all these failures of leadership that were kind of obvious in retrospect, but that caused all these disasters in world history. And so this book is kind of like taking that and applying that idea to Jewish history and saying, in the rearview mirror, there are all these things that we can see were so botched throughout Jewish history. And I think his argument is that they were botched in a very specific and recurring way. That and I don't know exactly much more than that because I haven't read it, but it's interesting to say, like, well, now something happened to us just now, say COVID, and all of a sudden we realize we've messed this thing up all along not just for the last 50 years, for 3,000 years. And I now have a new way of telling the Jewish story, which either I believe is factually correct, or it helps me today with what I'm trying to accomplish to look at it that way. And it's not wrong to look at it that way. I can't prove it to you, but I'm going to start telling the story in a new way, not only looking forward, but also looking backward. And I don't know. I think earlier in the conversation, I was clear on exactly where I was going with this idea, but like something about it feels like it's something in our quiver of arrows.
Yeah, you're reminding me of who is it that I've been quoting incessantly? Philosophy professor from the University of Chicago.
I think Leon Kass.
Leon Kass, yeah, Leon Kass. His idea that the power of traditional stories is not that they tell us what happened, but what always happens. And I think that's the task to look at your own time and to see what's failing, not as some unique new failure, but what's the failure that this is a symptom of that we keep doing over and over and over?
Mm-hmm.
What's the mistake here?
Well, yeah, and I guess what I would say, like for me, what feels like the mistake that keeps happening these days is the belief that what makes something Jewish is if it was Jewish before.
Mm,
Where if you actually look at Jewish history, you actually see that most of what's Jewish previously wasn't Jewish. It was something that was Judaized. And so if we are insisting that what it means to be Jewish as we move into the future is to have this conservationist mentality, then we're going to get it wrong. And that wasn't the approach of our ancestors by definition, because we see over and over again that they took things from the. That's why I was interested last week when we were talking to Shai Secunda about, like, well, what did we get from ancient Iran? What did we, because, and it turns out like everything, we got from somewhere, but it's no less Jewish. We made it Jewish. And so it's like, what would it look like today to be able to, so then when we say, hey, look, we've got a, situation, a lot of Jews don't want to be so Jewish, whatever, they're moving away, they don't like the rabbinic authority. It's like, okay, well, let's do something really new that is based on what they do like, and we'll turn it into Jewish. We'll bring the Jewish stuff into this discussion with that. And that'll be the most Jewish thing ever. And it's like, you couldn't get funding for that because that's not
exactly.
that's understood to be like not a Jewish thing. And it's the most Jewish thing.
Right. I'm just sitting with what you just said. That's it. That's it. That's it.
So,
That's it.
so how do we? Yeah.
I don't even want to say anything else. I mean, I think we have to sit with that. I think you put your finger right on it. That is the mistake of today.
So
that
then
what
I think
was, yeah.
No, so then I think that this the connection to Tisha B'Av is like, is it possible, I suppose, is it possible that we have this genius technology that we have also forgotten, which is that in order to free ourselves to go where we need to go, we at least can imagine. And so like we were saying earlier, we don't want to say synagogues are the thing that we're going to remember, but we have to imagine that everything that we love today or don't love might end up in the Tisha B'Av of the future. And that means that there's maybe the bookends to what I said about not only things that are Jewish is that we have to be prepared to let go everything that we do understand to be Jewish. And we actually have technologies for both of those things. And if we misunderstand the technologies that we have as simply about the grief of the loss of the thing that we actually don't want anymore, and that we're totally misunderstanding what it is. And it's like when you say that we totally misunderstand the Talmud because we think it's about the content, but it's actually about the thinking process and how we can move forward. If we look at our holidays and we misunderstand them to be about grieving over something that was really the best kind of Judaism and what, we're just nothings now, then we're just missing it. And actually what these things are is like brilliant psychological tools that actually allow us to move forward. And instead they're holding us back.
Mic drop. I think that's
Well,
it. I think that's it. I think that insight, that Kramer talks about, that happened at the last major crash, that we can no longer actually know truth. We have to, with humility, hold on to our best guess of truth, of what, very lightly. And we actually started holding on to all of our practices and holidays and ideas so tight that we've kind of strangled them. And we have to go back, like you say, be willing to have everything be in the Tisha B'Av of 2,000 years from now, and hold it lightly. Yeah.
I mean, it reminds me of a conversation, I know we're wrapping up, is that a few weeks ago or months ago, I was having a conversation with Lex, my co-host on Judaism Unbound, and I said to him, something about, we were talking about reimagining the high holidays, and I said something or other, and he thought he was agreeing with me, and he said, yeah, I really could get rid of most of the things that we do in the high holidays, except there's like 5 things that I would say I want to hold on to. And I said to him, okay, now imagine the high holidays without those 5 things. You know, that because that's where the hard work is, you know,
That's great.
and that's where, you know, you say like, I can't imagine without those 5 things. That's why we have Tisha B'Av. You know, that's why we have studying the things we no longer do. That's why we have the Messiah, is because we have this idea that it's somehow you have to let go. I also don't feel like I could let go of beloved family members, but we know that they die, and then we have things that we do about it, so that allow us to continue and live our lives. And you would never say in advance, like, I want this beloved family member to die. Of course not. You would want them to drink from the fountain of youth and live forever. But you also know that when they die, they shouldn't hold you back. And so you come up with ways. How do I do that? And it's not easy, but we do. And that's why I always say, like, Judaism is so good at death. You know, everyone says it. Judaism is so good at like death of a person. I actually think we have been really great at the death of Judaism too. It's just that we've forgotten that stuff. So maybe, you know, maybe a holiday like this is one that allows us to, as at a time like this, is that it allows us to try to remember that we actually do have these traditions.
Yeah, and you've also shifted Tisha B'Av for me from the letting go of the things you really don't want to the real pain of having to let go of the things you
Right,
wanted,
right.
but you can't have anymore.
That's the most important thing, I think. Yeah.
Wow.
Okay. Well,
Mm.
we should have a program note next week. We think we'll be on Friday, not on Thursday. So check Facebook, Jewish Life Facebook to know for sure. We'll post when that's going to be. But you are off to Queer Talmud Camp, which is virtual,
Yes.
virtual
Yay.
Queer Talmud Camp. So
Diaspora edition.
diaspora edition. So good luck. I'll miss you, but I'm going to be
Thank you.
pushing. I hope wonderful things will be happening there, and we'll see you
Thank you.
probably on Friday.
Yes.
Great.
All
Bye,
right.
Dean.
Bye-bye.